Good morning, welcome everyone. My name is Michael Aguirre, and today we're going to be talking about secure network architecture and really some of the new concerns around how do we assure the enterprise in such a complex and changing environment. A lot of what we have to deal with around networking architecture has changed significantly in the last 2 to 3 years, and will change even more in the next 24 months. So, really what I wanted to talk about first is what is the definition of secure network architecture? What's the scope of our conversation today? And for a lot of people, the definition means a lot of different things. And so for us, what I want to talk about really is not just the concept of the network from a hardware perspective, but really what allows us to provide that core infrastructure of communications that enable business transactions. So we're going to talk about the business requirement through the services, through the mechanisms and the actual components, the nuts and bolts, the routers, the firewalls, the wiring that provide the end-to-end service for our businesses. Now, perspective on this again has changed, and really where have we come from? And it's when you look at it, it can be quite overwhelming quite quickly. We started 15, 20 years ago really having to work with a network and a data center in a very isolated environment. And that's grown as our businesses have grown over time, where often a lot of us are managing multiple networks, multiple data centers. We have branch offices, we have mobile employees we have to deal with now. We have remote contractors who are actually integrated into our business through our branches remotely or in other locations. And our clients and customers are beginning to interact not just through one single conduit, but with us and our remote contractors, with our partners, with our service providers in new ways. We don't provide the end-to-end transaction for customers by ourselves now. It's a chain of enablement. And then we, to add into the mix, really in the last 2 to 3 years here is that, the cloud service providers and cloud services we architect for ourselves really change that relationship even further. And last but not least, we have to now really concern ourselves with regulators and governments in a new way. Not only are they looking at us on an annual basis, as a review, as an audit, but they are beginning to become a part of our daily lives with all the different transactions and monitoring that's going on. Regulations is becoming real time. And that's a major concern about how we need to look at our architecture around networking in the future. On top of this, when we look at connectivity, how do all these different actors relate to us? Well, sometimes we have our wired connections, which used to be, thank goodness, the only thing we had to deal with. Well, now we have Wi-Fi, which really, in a number of different workplaces has totally obliterated any form of hardware connectivity. Most of our laptops nowadays don't even have an Ethernet port. So we're gone full circle. My Sharp PC3100 I bought on eBay, an old 286 mobile laptop, didn't have an Ethernet port. And here we go, we've come full circle. Well, we have Wi-Fi now, but really it's unknowingly, a lot of us have created bottlenecks or different concerns in our environment that we didn't have to worry about even just a handful of years ago. And now, add in high-speed cellular, like LTE. I find for a lot of business users has finally woken them up about what kind of remote accessibility they can have. Specifically, I found for environments going from mobile connectivity via 3G to an LTE or another 4G type of service has been that the complexity and bandwidth requirements that people are demanding from the business has greatly changed. And the bottlenecks are not just with us, but with, zooming into that cellular environment, the different types of telcos and carriers that are involved with that service. So when we look at that, really our networking relationships, a lot of people use the concept of the borderless network, which I personally disagree with, but you can see here it's a complex, convoluted, mesh network that ends up enabling these transactions. And the key thing is that, you see here, like what are the borders that are put in place? And the challenge is that we don't live in a borderless society. What has happened that the borders that we need to protect ourselves are no longer physical. They are virtual. They are policy driven. And we have to be very certain of where they are. And that's really part of what I want to get into today. When we look at what's going across this complex mesh, inside the networks, that breadth of services, the demand for bandwidth, and the demand for other attributes around quality of service, integrity, privacy, non-repudiation of source, of destination, of audit, of transaction. There's a lot more specifics regarding quality of service and quality of service provision that are coming into play. And of course, happening not just within our directly controlled networks, but within our transaction environments, our cloud providers, other telco carriers, etc. So now that complexity of applications, of transactions going on, is making us have to reevaluate the priorities of the business network and the business network architecture and what security means. What is it that we're truly assuring? Another point of view is that the breadth of and scope of service provision and transaction delivery on our networks has changed. It's not just the business apps anymore. It's security, it's SCADA, it's telecommunications, video communications, wide media. It's a whole number of different things that were not on our IP networks 5 years ago, 10 years ago, but now are expected to be. We look at a lot of power environments, even municipal governments with SCADA service delivery. This concept that we have our corporate network and our SCADA network separate, unfortunately for a lot of us, is just not a reality we're going to be able to maintain, that complete separateness, over the next 5 to 10 years. And a core reason for that is how virtualization is changing our environments. And that's sort of the key element here. When we look at what's on our network and how we connect to different environments, well, we have our data centers, our workplace, we have all the mobile devices, we have the internet of everything, anything that can be connected. And that virtualization and that segmentation that's happening is causing some new challenges. And you look at this virtual network that connects all these different types of physical worlds together. We have real network domains that allow us to connect into that virtual hub. We have virtual, jumping points that allow it to talk into the big cloud, if you will. And there's different virtual networks and VLANs and supports across it. And then again, back out from that virtual world to other third parties, cloud providers, brokers, you name it. So what was the lovely secure domain, the eggshell type of environment 10, 20 years ago, is now nowhere near as easy to deal with. It's a mixture, it's a hybrid, and it's organic. It changes as your business changes, as your client environment changes, and it has to be receptive to dynamic change. If it doesn't, what will end up happening is failures, breaches will happen where the end user, the transaction, finds a way to occur beyond your controlled environment. So it's a new way of dealing with the problem we have to look at, and it's really about how do we have an end-to-end assurance strategy for network security, and how do we control the complexity? How do we manage that change on a regular and ongoing basis? For us, I want to talk about 3 key things today. We want to reevaluate network security posture, deal with our network architecture, and reevaluate the network technologies that are supporting this new environment for us. So let's look at network security posture first. Really, how do we answer the questions that are keeping us up at night, yet do it in a manner that we can actually succeed with? That we're inevitably still fighting fires, dealing with new changes, and looking forward and managing change, and planning for the future, takes a lot of time. I want to talk about, an enterprise blueprint that has been around for a while. It's it's a tier 1 vendor, and the solutions that we need. It's not new. It's not something that's coming out today. A lot of what we're striving for today, people have been talking about and telling us about for the last 5 to 7 years. So let's just look at this blueprint that these folks are talking about. Secure the new enterprise. We need a new architecture. It has to have a couple important features. We need high level policy. Talk about the business to get full context of the situation. We need constant policy enforcement, independent of security. We have to be hybrid, spanning those virtual worlds. We have to have global knowledge of what's going on in our environments. And it has to be highly distributed. All sounds great. Well, who did this? Sorry, first off, this isn't a blueprint of what has to happen in the future. It's actually what has to happen today. Perfect. Well, who said this and when? Well, this is Cisco from 2011. The answers here have been around for some time. Why aren't we doing that? Why aren't we doing these key elements around getting this context, spanning these hybrid worlds, getting the distributed and security scanning environment and enforcement environment we want? Well, let's drill into that for a second. Let's talk about what is needed to execute this vision. Well, understanding the full context, what are some things we're going to need? Well, business context has to be translated into technical requirements. That means service levels. We're going to have knowledge about the different entities in the transactions so we can prioritize service levels and escalate. We have to have exception tracking for the inevitable business situations that come up. And then a lot of knowledge regarding privacy and regulation constraints that are put upon us. Policy enforcement. Well, having independent needs to have clear lines of accountability. Making sure that response, control can happen. People have accountability and authority to do it. And it can be automated into the business and into the technical environment. And that's where that separation of the infrastructure, application and control layer, software-defined network, and we're going to talk about later on. We're going to have to build this environment where very clearly when something is seen as out of bounds, it can be dealt with immediately, and there's the speed of decision making is sped up. Spanning these virtual worlds, we have to have visibility across this entire environment. We're going to have trusted out-of-band ways of communicating, auditing, and checking these interconnected parts of our brokered service. And that centralized visibility is going to have not just visibility, but access and control over all of the environments in scope to our business, in scope to our transactions, in scope to the relevant client and service delivery aspects of our business. So it's not just seeing it, it's being able to do something about it. Now, taking a slightly different view, now really getting that visibility and control, we need to have an understanding of what's out there that's going to impact our business. Understanding the scope of and risks relevant to our business. So it's not just about knowing about everything, it's about what we should care about today and prioritizing that for action. So we need to have a lot of information sharing regarding that extended enterprise, our cloud providers and other types of related parties, to make sure that threats that are relevant to us, threats that are relevant to them, we're understood about how it impacts our transactions and monitor that horizon to move forward. In all honesty, when you look at the complexity of what people ask here, it truly looks like we need an omnipresence. And that's something, there's debatably, there's only a handful of folks who've ever figured that out, and I can tell you I'm not one of them. So it's a large order. The key thing here is understanding what is in scope to the business. How do we filter it down and make sure that global knowledge is captured as relevant to us? So that brings down this concept of correlation in real time. Centralizing data, normalizing it, making sure we have access to validate those impact scenarios. Take that global threat knowledge and prioritize it and have it in a real-time fashion, looking at our applications, the systems, the networks, and the users. So this highly distributed environment, needs to have a real-time capability of visibility and assessment focused on the knowns, the applications of users, and the unknowns, all the things that could happen to us. So, why haven't we done this? Not only the complexity, like we got 19 items here that are all tall orders unto themselves, but we also end up very, very inevitably with a police state if we're not too careful. All of these security services, if we implemented them with only the security industry perspective in mind, we'd end up with a very over-controlled business, an over-controlled enterprise, government service, you name it. And it's not because we need it. It's not because we want it. It's because without context, without prioritization from the business, developing this level of control can become overwhelming, not just for the implementer, but for the business it's impacting. So we need to keep that in mind. How are we going to get that balance of architecture? And last, our 20th requirement is, how do we implement this within a cost, scope, and effort appropriate? In the Cisco report here, they talked about it being necessary today. Well, so let's call today in the next 12 months, in our current year horizon. It's something we're going to deal with now. Well, all of what we talked about, these 20 items, really, what's one of the first things regarding cost that comes to mind? I don't got the money. My executive's not going to give me the money. This is too much. And herein lies one of the greatest challenges security practitioners, managers, CISOs, and the related staff are going to have over the next 24 months. Is we have spent a lot of money on infrastructure and architecture, and we need to spend more. We need to prepare for these changes. And as this cloud brokered service environment, extended enterprise happens, we need to be proactive because we don't know how we're going to be impacted in the future. So we're asking for money for things that haven't happened yet. We're trying to ask to promote resiliency. And a lot of times they're going to see that police state. They're going to say, well, why the control? We haven't needed it to date. So there's this balance between these two pieces of imagery we're really going to have to keep in mind. So from a network security posture perspective, what it comes down to is building an environment of control management. We need to understand where we need control, how it relates to the business, how it relates to actionable scenarios in our business. So let's start with network access. This is why we need a network. We need critical infrastructure. We need ability for business transactions to occur. So in this world of in these top 20 elements we need to build into our environments, we know we're going to have some sort of ability to manage crypto keys and identity and access management. Now, if you're a Lavabit, a secure email posting service that got shut down, monitored and or abused, depending on your personal opinion, by the NSA. Crypto key management was critical to their service, and inevitably, unified cryptographic key management in our business environments is a capacity and a capability that's going to become extremely important in the next 5 years. It's probably something, especially if you're a sub 1,000 user business right now, that is happening inherently in your environments. There's some kind of centralization and tracking that might be very informal. Hell, you might have one or two folks doing it very formally, which would be awesome. But the complexity of it and the breadth of it working with your cloud providers and other service providers, it's now going to have to be a real capability. So when you look at this provision, now this would allow us to basically get known identities onto our network and have ability to secure, encrypt the fundamental communications. Around that, we look at that global threat protection. How do we make sure that transaction is protected? Well, we're going to have an understanding what the assets are. We're going to have to look at the kinds of threats that are out there, and then do that vulnerability management. Make sure that network and those transactions, those entities aren't impacted. And from there, when we know we have a vulnerability, well, we're going to have to monitor. So we're going to have log and management correlation, an incident response plan, a forensics and investigation plan that works with the business, validates the vulnerabilities, puts it in context for the business, and lets us move forward. And of course, part of that's going to be lessons learned, making sure that from our investigations, forensics, we're doing good software development. We learn from our changes from vulnerabilities are valid from us. And then there's going to be education awareness. And those lessons learned, that scope and context that is relevant, we got to push it through for education awareness throughout the organization. So, simplistically, using the word lightly, we have a number of business services that have to exist within our security services program. And this is going to have to, there's going to be a lot of interdependencies and marriage and execution ordering here. And they're supported by a complement of different types of business level elements and technology related elements. So we need to have needs analysis at the business level, policy and planning management, risk management, the assurance and contract management aspects, just to name a few. We have our compliance, change management, security, facility, and operations elements to look at. And these will interact with a number of the different elements of our security services suite. So secure network architecture is not just about the unified threat management device we throw on our network. As our extended enterprise matures, we need to look at this service element more formally, more maturely to enable the technical controls. It's, over the last 5 to 10 years, really depending on our size, we've been able to look at these services very informally, very organically, very much a part of our different business departments. We now need to look at this as a service-oriented architecture. The choice for any sized business truly no longer exists. And this is really key one I wanted to paint for you. From here, just to add some more context, this is not all we need to consider. There's new business models that exist that require other minimum security services. So if you're a virtual goods provider, so I sell pink fur coats within whatever the next Second Life is going to be. It's a purely digital product. How do I secure that? How do I manage that? How do I allow for secure exchange of product, sale of product between third parties? And that's required different services. Data brokers, infrastructure brokers, the concept of brokering and technology as a brokering capability within our businesses themselves is going to add in more complexity and more timeliness requirements for the services we provide. And inevitably, we're only going to be able to spend so much money and spend so much time on this. So there's going to be control limitations with how we interact with third parties. If I'm working with Amazon as a 100-person company in Canada, the chances of me telling them how I want to interact with their environments right now, it's going to fall on deaf ears for the most part. They're going to tell me what they've provided me and I use it or not, or go to the other provider. So for a lot of us, there's these limitations about what other vendors are willing to give us or can give us. And even our current existing service providers, even though they're going to tell us they all have cloud services now, they're going to be using old protocols, old systems, old encryption levels, and we're going to have to work with these. We're going to have to be able to manage the best case in a worst case world. And a lot of this will happen, we're seeing it already. The concept of resiliency is changing. For a lot of us, you might have seen the Rogers outage or the Bell outage, Shaw outages that have happened across Canada over the past several months. And a lot of us have realized that the definition of resiliency, assured bandwidth and mobility has changed for us. It used to just be, do we have 2 network connectivity options away from our office, from our data center? Well, now if we have a road wire and one carrier goes down and they're 12 hours, 24 hours, a week away from being back in the office, what's another carrier option we can provide for them? Does that carrier provide assured bandwidth? If I'm in Lethbridge versus Red Deer, can I assure that I have the right data bandwidth options available to do my business? And do I have an agreement for that? So we have to think about that. And of course, inevitably that at some point we can't rely on others. Even though others are becoming critical to our transactions, disaster recovery and business continuity, planning for the failover of major loads, is something a lot of folks are not truly taking seriously. What if Amazon goes away? What if Microsoft or any of our critical provider goes away? Are we going to be able to do business without them? is the business willing to invest in a solution, in a network architecture that will allow us to continue business without this infrastructure? Are these third-party providers critical to us? Do we understand our relationship? And do we have a worst-case scenario backup plan? A lot of us don't right now. And last but not least, we think of privacy. How we integrate in this extended enterprise, how we allow transactions to occur across our network, how we're monitoring them and controlling them. What are the expectations of the user? What are our liabilities around the content, the transaction, and context? That's a lot of stuff we're going to have to keep in mind. So in context of the business and consideration of the complexity, we have to answer a lot of questions around our posture. What's going to truly enable the business? What's aligned with our capability and capacity? How mature do we need to be? How much is enough? And what is our deployment going to look like? And who's our consumers? This is going to shape, understanding the business is going to shape, the true architectural design requirements. And of course, last but not least, what's the true constraint of cost? So from a posture perspective, really, to simplify all of this, we need to ask ourselves, based on our needs, what is our capable and capacity to detect issues and scenarios that are relevant to us, that can impact us, and the attributes that we need? What is our capability and capacity to track and respond? For detection, it's all about, choosing a cosmological horizon. We talked about that global threat profile. Do we need to have a staff employee who's monitoring what kinds of 0 days are being created in Australia right now for a version of Android that's coming out next month? We don't even have in our environment right now. Is that something we need to do or not? How far out, how big is our cosmos, and how far are we looking out? Choosing that horizon creates a lot of sanity. You know what? And it's not being right or wrong. It's the maximum investment you and your executive are willing to make. If it's relevant, if it shows up in my email box from a vendor we have work with right now, and it's directly relevant to my app, I care about it. Other folks, it's like, well, if we're going to use that technology in the next year or two, we want to know about it now and plan for it in our integrations. So you got to think about it. So we really choose, are we going to have a wide and deep capacity around monitoring our posture, or is it going to be narrow and specific? Focus on relevance. And narrow and specific is a lot more time consuming, a lot more specialty than wide and deep. We can just throw resources at wide and deep and most stuff will stick. Narrow and specific requires us to truly understand our business. So reviewing the scope of attackers and actors is going to be much more relevant, but it's going to cost. Wide and deep has a lot of big data costs, where narrow specific's a little bit cheaper, but the detailed rules are going to be much more complex. So choose that horizon. For tracking, we need to create an event horizon. So it's the exact opposite of the cosmological horizon, which is how far out. Event horizon's how far in. And I had a forensics is probably the best culprit of this, where I've had a number of conversations with folks who will say, how do I know this file got copied off this USB drive? And if you look at Windows, how do we know a user copied this file from the system to the USB? The exact act of copying a file in Windows is actually not a finite thing. It's very subjective, especially when you get timestamps and exact timestamps involved between two devices. So, quite literally, I've witnessed very good, very expert people debate this topic of, did a file copy for well over a week. For a lot of businesses, what could equate? That could equate to 10 grand worth of labor. Do we need to go that far? How far in do we need to look, and what's relevant, and at what point do we need approval for that? Because when we get into big data, what's going to kill you is your event horizons getting smaller and smaller. At one point in time, in the next couple of years, a vendor is going to come to you and say, we can put this bit level X-ray across your entire environment. You can see every 0 and 1, every binary decision that happens physically or otherwise in your world, and you'll be able to see everything. You'll get omnipresence. But honestly, is it worth it to you? We need to track more than just IP addresses nowadays, but how far? Last but not least, we need to respond. Create and refine our incident response scopes and figure out how we're sharing knowledge with those other actors in our extended enterprise to reduce our future exposure and how we're impacting others. So we need to understand these capabilities, and make sure that our executives are aware of this perspective. So with this view, let's reevaluate some specific network architectures. What is the mix of what we're going to have to look at? Some of our capabilities, one of my favorite, I use the word experts in this world today is Gene Kim. And he talks about a lot of amazing topics, but, in my words, assurance, provision of good quality service, and what security and what a lot of people expect from security comes from very good, very well optimized, well managed, resilient environments and technologies. And a lot of us just suck at doing that, and realizing that we're pointing the security impact issues at the security people, when really if we got better at resiliency, at managing our networks, at managing our applications, our businesses, we would need less security inherently. It would be built into our environments. Again, he has a much more elegant way of saying that, but it comes down to a couple key things: intelligence, visibility, coordination, and control. Around our intelligence and our architecture, how do we monitor exposure? What points do we have to look at exposure and raise visibility of it? And where do we see attackers and actors? For visibility, knowing that event horizon, how are we going to get full visibility to transactions, and how deep does it need to be? And how does that visibility to the business happen? When we detect, track, and respond, what level of coordination do we need across that extended enterprise? How will a third-party cloud provider, if there's a breach or an issue in their environment, and a logging it, a log that we need tracked, how are we going to pull that back? How are we coordinating? Is it automated? Is it manual? Is it human? We need to inspect that in our architectural environment. And last but not least, control. Where are the things that are going to control the apps, the files, the domains that enable things like our APTs, that enable fraud? So not just looking at control from best practice and what can help us turn off and turn on the service, but what will work in very clear and clean ways for us. A favorite one for me is, if we have unknown crypto environments, why is it there? Block it until somebody tells us why we have it. It's like the firewall: deny any, all, and then we work from there. Businesses right now are not, are letting a lot of encrypted traffic out of their environments. They don't know what it is. They can't see what it is. And thankfully, we have a lot of new controls, very cheap controls, that will let us identify, filter, and escalate monitoring around these types of scenarios. So evaluating based on this capability to act, we can look at things like content security, exposure limitation, and a lot of the traditional things in between. But it's really about looking at a view from the tried and trusted concepts of defense in depth and mediated access, all these great things that we've done in the future, inspecting them through a new set of goggles, making sure we're aware of the economics, this complex investment. What is the right balance for us? That cosmological horizon and event horizon, what's that balance and what does it mean to the business? Who owns the architecture in this extended enterprise? Because the architecture, the controls in our architecture, can be owned by multiple parties, not just our business. How do we own the architecture to make sure that third parties don't, and their opinions and their changes don't impact us in ways we're not willing to invest in or commit to? So it requires a lot of transaction-based control design and unifying that control. And it's not just about buying a vendor dashboard. It's about really actually being able to marry control to that service strategy we saw from a posture point of view. So again, from there, now this is probably the part you guys really wanted to hear about, right? It's about we can't just forget about the architecture itself. Well, we have to figure out the routing and traffic options, the fair network usage policies. How are we going to build a control plane around our network that's going to allow enforcement and true performance management in the future. How do we manage the end-to-end user profiles and deal with service brokering, cloud services and platform management and monitoring. So oddly enough, though, these neat controls, these neat architecture elements need to be balanced with these requirements from above. Now, when we get into some of the very specifics, like a very powerful thing we have today is the integration of application signaling. People talk about application-aware firewalls and IPSs and all that kind of stuff. Well, it's great to be aware, but can we do anything? If an IPS, if another network control sees something, can we have an open bus to talk to an application and let it understand it needs to prevent, it needs to control, it needs to escalate or automate an action to prevent something bad from happening? Fraud management, true business level management, is going to happen through application signaling techniques that some already exist but are going to be very popular over the next 3 to 5 years. So how is that going to happen today? What's important to you? Do you have the bus available? And what does that mean? Not just from a networking, but from a virtualization and a third-party connectivity standpoint. How are we going to have scalable rules to manage our data plane? And I'm going to get into software-defined networking in a bit, but as these environments expand, how are we going to ensure control and have it relevant to our economics environment? From there, you can also get into some very specific IPsec implementation options where now that we know our transaction environments, let's lock them down in infinitum. And there's some very real ways of locking down an environment using IPsec physically and virtually today that are extremely cost effective as long as you've planned out and understood all these requirements to date. And just at one step lower, you look at some of the complementary controls that exist, like security service strategies and application signaling types of issues or service control issues around TCP wrappers. We need to look at making sure that the administrative and application server aspects have a relationship with the network so we can monitor and respond. So we need to understand the mechanisms that will meet the performance requirements we need. So have we identified what kinds of security mechanisms will allow us to get what we want? It's not just about an IPS. When people talk about a next generation IPS like we will in a second, well, that control, what are the mechanisms? What is it doing? What is it providing that we really want? Does it have the capability for application signaling? What's the scope of that? And does it give me the performance I need? What kinds of consolidation regarding my physical and virtual environments are possible? Do these mechanisms that I need, where do I need them? Physical, virtual, otherwise? And can I marry them out into third-party policy environments? And last but not least, have the consumers, the people who are going to be receiving these services from us, had a say in approving our concepts. The application developers, the service brokers in our environments, internally and externally. Are we going to architect controls in this control strategy that are relevant to them? So zooming down to the last layer, let's talk about reevaluating some of the explicit network technologies. And some of these next generation devices that are supposed to change our world. Well, when we look at some of the firewall controls that exist, they do a lot of things now. It's not just a firewall. There's application control mechanisms, malware, policy mechanisms, and network analysis intelligence mechanisms. There's a lot that it can do, and these are the word mechanisms. As a control, these are mechanisms this type of control has, and some of these are relevant to us. Some could be useful to us, and some require service complexity we may not have today. So, a lot of people are buying these because threats are being advertised as more complex, more impacting to us, more scary. And a lot of regulation is just saying, just throw this stuff in and check the box. The reality is that, again, the more of these mechanisms we have, the more failure points we have, the more false sense of security we have unless they're developed properly. And nothing spells this out better than the next generation intrusion prevention. And when somebody talks about anomaly detection, what the heck does that mean to us? Are they detecting anomalies that are relevant? Does to my transactions, to my business? Like what does this mean? And things like SSL inspection, does this impact my privacy expectations? There's a lot to be understood. WAN optimization is actually one of the most interesting aspects that inherently is a true network optimization type of thing to deal with, but has some major security considerations as well. Traffic squeezers can eliminate bottlenecks within the WAN or even the WAN proxy, but what a lot of these things are doing is they're modifying, and simplifying, compressing the kinds of traffic that are going on in your environment. So, WAN proxy, based on traffic that's gone through before, it uses an algorithm to simplify and reference information to get more information through the pipe using these existing references. What does that mean for your firewalls, for your IPSs, for your auditing, for your network monitoring, for packet replay, packet capture for forensics? These are questions a lot of people haven't answered. A siloed part of their business has put these devices in place, and now they realize they're missing critical information to deal with network security for actual business forensics properly. And so these are great things to value, but you need to understand how they impact your visibility. And again, if it's beyond your event horizon, if it's in the black hole, so be it. Perfect. But if these things are impacting data outside your event horizon, things that you care about, you need to make sure that you understand that, and it's a part of your security program's plan. So just cracking open this kind of subject, I want to talk about software-defined networking. Now there's two key elements that exist today. There's the open flow standard, the HP, and a couple other big vendors are on board. It exists today. It's I'll use the word stable at the moment. There's a lot of change. Open Daylight is another standard through the Linux Foundation, and we're really just waiting for the white box cloud effect, where Google and a lot of these guys build their own routers, build their own solutions, and Open Daylight is the foundation on which they're doing it. So what software-defined networking will be 10 years from now, we don't know. The standards we're using are going to go through a lot of change yet. But why are people marketing it to us now? Why do we need to start thinking about it and architecting around it now? Because it creates some major value for us. From a scalability and agility perspective, we can now manage and control things at a greatly optimized fashion. And so it's being promoted as a great solution, but we're going to talk about some of the complexity and insecurity. One example here, the Open Daylight architecture. It's just about, really simplistically, we're extracting applications from control from my data layers. And there's a number of APIs and different protocols and interfaces that will allow us to deal with between virtual and physical devices. From an open flow point of view, they simplified it here. We're just seeing the control plane and our data plane. But it's the key here is that our physical devices managing the data plane, switching and moving around the environment, will be separated from the routing control and the decision making and that control plane. And that separation of what do the devices do, how do they move our traffic around, separating that from our virtual control now creates new areas of concern. So this new control is centralized, but that means it's centralized, and it's centralized from a simplification standpoint. It can create choke points for good things like access, inspection, and audit. And it can handle a lot of neat dynamically handle a number of issues like denial of service that for us, when we were controlling things at a single point, it didn't allow so many options. We can now reroute things. And I think of Star Trek. I can reroute power from the engines to the shields. I now can manage my environment in a totally different way in that matrixed environment. But it's immature. And a lot of the availability and resiliency things we need are not well understood. So again, when this one central controller exists, we can create denial of services directly on that controller. And it becomes a chicken before the egg. Well, we're not going to have one controller. We're going to have a virtual server that's going to be existing in our virtual environment. Well, great. Well, we can actually there's a whole new set of congestion issues and denial of service issues that we have to look at that we just don't understand yet. And attackers are working on right now. So, as we get more into SDN and what it's going to do for your secure network architectures, again, there's some valuable stuff like OpenFlowSec, amazing folks working on things like, services around malware quarantining, data loss, intelligence gathering. There's perfect stuff that is going to be available in options in the very near future. Some are already today, but we need to look at where we're going on that. So we need to select components that have that right balance of centralization versus distributed management. We need to review the level of access control you get them from third-party environments and understand how things like SDN are going to impact your plan 5 years out. So we have to educate folks on these interdependencies that are here and are yet to come. So you look at that, the thing like SDN, and back to that service portfolio we'll need to manage to assure a secure posture. It's going to get more complex, or at least need to be more mature and more formal in our response. So we need to tie this all together with performance from the business, understand that relationship between services, mechanisms, and components, and look ahead, look at these new technologies, and make sure you have a planning horizon, that that cosmological horizon that's out far enough, relevant to the business.